Okay. We had left off talking about the about 1854 and the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. To review, we had talked about Stephen A. Douglas, the senator from Illinois, had pushed through Congress very aggressively this bill to organize both the Kansas territory here and the Nebraska territory here in 1854, believing that this would give Illinois a better chance for the proposed transcontinental railroad that would end up out here in California. The the prevailing thought was that if this would happen, then there was a chance that Kansas would become a slave state. Notice, though, that that is in direct violation of the Missouri Compromise. If we draw the Missouri Compromise line right through here, then we realize that Kansas is above the Missouri Compromise line. So, how do we solve that? Well, Douglas proposed that we undo the Compromise of 1820 and allow Kansas to choose how it would come into the Union. And in this case, by popular sovereignty, that idea that we've talked about before of allowing the territories to choose whether or not they want to come in as a slave state or as a free state. This opens up Kansas, and once the Kansas-Nebraska Act pushes its way through Congress and becomes law, this opens up Kansas to become a battleground. And we talked before the break that this is going to lead to several things. One is going to be warfare in Kansas, which I'll kind of come back to in a minute and remind you about. But the other is this: the birth of the Republican Party. The Kansas-Nebraska Act does more to create the Republican Party. The Republican Party is it's a conglomeration of disaffected party members from various parties who just feel like they don't have a place anymore in either the Democratic Party or the kind of failing Free Soil Party or the up and sort of coming Know Nothing Party, which is really strictly almost an anti-immigrant party. But there are a lot of people that did not feel like they had a place anymore. And so Northern Whigs, Northern Democrats, Free Soilers, who all probably shared a belief in limiting at least slavery's expansion. Some might have even been abolitionists. Okay. And if you were opposed to the Kansas Nebraska Act or you were opposed to either the expansion of slavery or even slavery in general, you found a place in the Republican Party. And so this is one of the first times that we see party realignment. And in this case, we're going to see a party that is essentially born into a party that is in opposition of slavery. We talked about the situation in Kansas over the next 2 years after 1854 and after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Essentially, a war plays out in Kansas as Free Soilers and abolitionists push people into Kansas to try to oppose the territory going towards slavery. And of course, at the same time, Southerners and especially Missourians will push into Kansas trying to sway the vote to the slavery side. And it leads to several instances of just out and out warfare, lawlessness, and by the end of it, you're going to have several different proposals to put Kansas into the Union either as a slave state or as a free state. The battles in Kansas bleed over even into the halls of Congress. The one of the most famous incidents is the caning of Senator Charles Sumner. The Sumner was a senator from Massachusetts who made an impassioned speech both against slavery and about the situation in Kansas. And he blamed states' writers and people, especially South Carolinians, who had sort of followed John C. Calhoun, as the causes of all this mess. A member of the House, a Congressman, Preston Brooks from South Carolina, hears about Sumner's speech and storms his way into the U.S. Senate and beats Sumner almost to death with his cane. Beats him really almost to death right beside his desk in the Senate. So it takes Sumner almost 2 years to recover from the beating. In the South, Preston Brooks became a hero and was sort of referred to in all kinds of different ways as Hit Him Again Brooks, or his constituents sent him canes to replace the ones that he used to beat Sumner almost to death with. So the situation in Kansas is all out, was really a civil war, and it will not be resolved really until the Civil War breaks out. The Kansas does try to come into the Union as a slave state, but it is defeated in Congress, and really no action is taken on Kansas until really 1861, when many of the southern states had seceded, and then Kansas would be brought into the Union as a free state. But it is if there is one thing that sort of foreshadows what's about to happen, the situation in Kansas, of course, is it. The situation in Kansas also leads to the almost meteoric rise of John Brown. John Brown is responsible for, I'm going to go back a slide here, is responsible for, he and his family are responsible for the murder of 5 pro-slavery advocates right here at Pottawatomie Creek in May of 1856. Not only are these pro-slavery people killed by John Brown and his family, but they are hacked up into pieces. Essentially, the bodies are dismembered and hacked up, essentially with swords. And of course, that is a very very brutal response. John Brown was a very virulent, a very sort of hater, if you will, of slavery. He he believes that slavery is he really feels that he's called by God to put down slavery, and he takes his war on slavery, his crusade against slavery, very seriously. And in his mind, he was doing God's work. He was stamping out the evil of slavery. He escapes justice in Kansas and will eventually return back east. And we're not through with John Brown. I may have told you guys, I certainly may have told one of the other classes, that one of my favorite historians of the Civil War referred to and believed that John Brown was maybe the most important person leading up to the Civil War, that his actions terrified Southerners, forced them to really confront the idea that slavery may be under attack and that they could be wiped out. So it really starts. He argues that John Brown's actions led to the militia movement in the South, led to the Southerners starting to form their own militias, starting to think about how they're going to protect themselves. In the North, he becomes a hero, and abolitionist forces believe that he is a hero. And pretty soon after he tries to free the slaves in Virginia by seizing weapons at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, he's going to be arrested, put on trial, and executed, and then he turns into a martyr. So John Brown may be the most important figure in the coming of this downward slide towards the Civil War. In 1856, James Buchanan was selected as president. The Republican Party nominated the Mexican War hero John C. Fremont, hero of California. He will carry the Republican banner into the 1856 presidential election. And of course, this is the first time the Republicans show up in our national politics. Millard Fillmore will run as well. Former President Millard Fillmore will run as well. Buchanan wins, and wins pretty decisively, as you guys can tell. Okay, he gets 45% of the popular vote. Millard Fillmore, as a third party, got over 25% of the popular vote. But Fremont and the Republicans do surprisingly well. When you look at it, they captured all of New England. They captured New York. They captured some of the free states around the Great Lakes and Ohio. And so if they can improve in some of these areas, then they're going to become a major threat to the Democratic Party. The election of 1856 also puts Buchanan into the presidency, and Buchanan is not going to really do a whole lot to ease the slide into the Civil War. He favors, for example, Kansas coming into in 1857. He signals that he would like Kansas to come in as a slave state, which Congress will shoot down. Excuse me. But the Buchanan is also going to do several things that are not going to put us on a very good footing as we go into what's going to become the Civil War. Shortly after taking office, we get one of the worst decisions, one of the worst things that happens in the lead up to the Civil War, the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision is a Supreme Court case that has been percolating for a while, but the decision will be handed down in 1857. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney from Maryland will hand down really what becomes the opinion. And Taney's very old. He's in his 80s. He's been around forever. He was appointed to the court by Jackson. He had been in Jackson's cabinet. So he's been on the court forever. And he's behind the times a little bit. He is staunchly pro-slavery. And his decisions oftentimes come down to the defense of slavery in many ways. The background to the Dred Scott decision is that Dred Scott, who you see here, was a slave. And he was encouraged, along with others, to sue for his freedom based on living in free territory for several years. His former masters had passed Dred Scott and his family and other slaves into the Sanford family. And then they sort of decided that they were going to run this test case. And Dred Scott was going to sue for his freedom. And the case will wind its way into the Missouri courts and then into the Supreme Court. And in 1857, the decision is handed down. The Dred Scott decision is catastrophic for several reasons. And Taney's decision here goes way beyond just deciding the fate of Dred Scott. In the first part of the decision, Taney says that Dred Scott is not going to get his freedom because Dred Scott is a slave. And as a slave, he is not a citizen. And citizens have no standing or non-citizens have no standing in the federal court. By saying that, essentially what Tawney does is make every slave in America not a citizen. He essentially declares all of the uh, the people who are enslaved in 1857 that they are not citizens. Now, we talk about what makes a citizen, and citizenship often talks about where you are born. If you are born on American soil, you become a citizen. And so, virtually every slave in 1857 had been born in America. And that meant that essentially what he did is uncitizenize, that's not a word, but it sounds good, that he basically takes away citizenship from every enslaved person. So that's terrible enough. But then he goes on. He also decides that in dealing with this idea of Dred Scott was going to be free because he had been on free territory for so long, that Tawney says that slaves are property. They are not people. Slaves are property, and therefore enjoy the essentially the all of the rights, all of the privileges of property under the Constitution. And so you should be able to take property anywhere in any state, no matter if it's free or slave. And essentially, what he does here is that not only does he say that Dred Scott's not a citizen, that Dred Scott is a piece of property, and that property can be taken anywhere without really worrying about free or slave. But also, basically, he shoots down some of the ideas of the Compromise of 1820 and even popular sovereignty. Basically, he says that Congress could not, when he talks about the free idea, or that Missouri and the idea of where he had been, that he had been above the a free territory and blah blah blah, that he essentially, Tawney basically says that the Compromise of 1820 is null and void, that popular sovereignty really doesn't really matter, and Congress can't decide free or slave no matter if they wanted to. And so the Dred Scott decision throws a monkey wrench in virtually everything that we've talked about up to this point. It is a devastating blow for the nation's slaves, because not only are they reduced in legal status down to property, but they are also they have their what could have been citizenship taken away from them. The if it goes bad from bad to worse, okay, if the Dred Scott decision isn't bad enough, in 1857 we have another panic, we have another depression. The Panic of 1857 and the Depression of 1857 is bad. There are a lot of reasons. The influx of gold from California, speculation in land, speculation in railroad lands, especially. There are all sorts of sort of causes for this. But the interesting thing about this one is that it gives the South a bit of mistaken hope. The panic is especially bad in the industrialized areas. There is a call to help protect businesses. There's a call to help protect the nation's manufacturing centers. Excuse me. And the reason is that the North and many of the nation's manufacturing areas, because it's not just an American depression, it actually kind of becomes a much bigger depression. But they don't fare very well. They really struggle. And the South, on the other hand, enjoys really high cotton prices, and does really well. And the same time, while the North and many of the industrialized areas are struggling, the South does very well economically. What it does is it falsely it gives the South false hope that their economy, King Cotton economy, is untouchable. That it is better than the North's economy, stronger than the North's economy, that they're able to weather storms that the North can't, and that's just simply not true. Yes, during this period of time, their economy does very well. Yes, cotton prices go up. Okay, and yes, that means there's more profit for them. But it is, trust me, it is a false hope. And it, I think, more than anything, the Panic of 1857 gave the South such false hope that they were willing to they were willing to take the next step and go out and think that they would be fine on their own without the North, without the other parts of the country, that they could get out and survive in the if there was if they had to leave the Union. And we all know that that's simply not going to be the case. The Panic of 1857 kind of, I think, in a lot of ways, also sort of gave the South this belief that they were untouchable, and that they could. It makes them into a little bit more of a proud bully, if you will, and that they're able to push these ultimatums, believing that the North simply couldn't let their economy go. So it, in a lot of ways, drives another wedge in between these sections of the nation. In 1858, you have, at least in politics, a dress rehearsal for what's going to happen a couple years later. The Illinois Senate seat is up for grabs, and there are two major candidates. The sitting candidate, all right, Stephen A. Douglas, the architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, is up for re-election, and he'll be opposed by Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, when he accepts really the Republican nomination for the senator in Illinois and goes on the campaign trail against against Douglas. He will, when he accepts it, make his House divided speech, saying that a house divided against itself cannot stand, that the nation cannot continue as half slave, half free. And so he challenges Douglas to a series of debates, and you can see where they are, okay, in Ottawa and Freeport, okay, and all across the state of Illinois. And Freeport, the Freeport debate is probably the most famous because in it, Lincoln sort of forces Douglas to talk about popular sovereignty. In the wake of the Dred Scott decision, he sort of forces Douglas to try to say something about can popular sovereignty exist? Can slavery be challenged in the wake of the Dred Scott decision? And Douglas's response is very carefully measured because Douglas has presidential hopes. He really believes that he's going to get reelected here, and then he wants to run for president in 1860. And so he has to be really careful here. And he measures his words very carefully. And unfortunately, it makes him come out looking kind of wishy-washy. And the South is going his sort of, I guess, very limited support of the expansion of slavery is going to cause many in the South to hop off his bandwagon. And we'll see that happen in 1860. Douglas wins, despite Lincoln's really good showing in all of these debates, Douglas does win and wins his Senate seat back. But of course, it propels Lincoln into really the hierarchy of the Republican Party, and he will get the presidential nomination in 1860. So Douglas, on the other hand, is kind of left trying to keep the South on his side, and that's not going to be very easy. In 1859, John Brown is back on the scene. He will attack a federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. What he's trying to do is to start a slave rebellion in Virginia. The plan was to steal the weapons from the arsenal. He and several of his sons were going to break into the arsenal, steal the weapons. At the same time, a slave rebellion broke out in the countryside, and he would be able to take these weapons and distribute them to the slaves, and you would have a massive slave insurrection on your hands in Virginia. Well, it's a great plan, except no one really communicated with the slaves very well, and they don't end up revolting like they should have, or they don't even go out and support. John Brown and his family get pinned down in the arsenal. There's a huge firefight at the arsenal as federal troops try to take the arsenal back. Several of John Brown's sons are killed, and he eventually surrenders. And he'll be put on trial and executed. And I told you guys that was, it turns him into a martyr. Many in the North saw him as a hero and as one who was willing to do whatever it took to defend the American slaves from the position of slavery. If you're a Southerner, this guy is trying to kill you in your bed. He's trying to kill you in your home, wherever you are. And that was enough to strike fear into the hearts of many Southerners. As we get to the 1860 presidential election, it became clear that this was a very scary time. The Democrats are split, and they are not going to be able to maintain their own unity as a party. They are going to, the party wanted to nominate Stephen A. Douglas. But I told you guys, Stephen A. Douglas is sort of wishy-washy, lukewarm embrace of slavery's expansion led many in the South to distrust him so much that they withdrew from the party. And they created their own political party, the Southern Democrats, and nominated John C. Breckinridge as their party candidate. So essentially, going into the election, you have the Democratic Party split between Southerners and Northerners. The Republican Party chooses Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln is the candidate, and there's a Constitutional Union Party candidate named John Bell, who will also be in the election. When you look at the results, okay, well, let's take a look at the Republican Party platform first, okay? Let's see what Lincoln was talking about out on the campaign trail, okay? Slavery would not be extended into the territories. There would be a protective tariff to help the northern industries. That's an outgrowth of the Panic of 1857, okay? There would be a government aid to build a Pacific Railroad, internal improvements, okay, homesteads for farmers, okay. When you look at this, you see how the Republican Party is trying to address each of those groups, okay. About the only one that really gets disappointed are the know-nothings who wanted the party to take a more anti-immigrant stance, which they don't. But you can see what they're after here. A lot of people believe that Lincoln hit the campaign trail in 1860 and that everywhere he went, he was talking about ending slavery, and that's simply not true. The Republican Party platform was built on this idea of not extending slavery. They don't say anything really about where slavery already existed. The abolitionist wing of the party, of course, wanted Lincoln to say more about abolishing slavery. He will not. Okay, the Republican Party platform is pretty clear. Do not extend slavery into any of the new territories. But nothing about ending slavery altogether. That's a pretty radical, I told you guys, that's a pretty radical idea. So the candidates all sort of line up here, and we all know that this is going to be a real tough election. The South has made it pretty clear that if Lincoln wins the election, there are going to be consequences. The South cannot, many of the southern states have already made it very clear that they do not feel like they can go on as a union with Lincoln as president, believing, of course, that Lincoln wants to end slavery, even though none of that is said, that is what's going to happen. And so, essentially, we are, as this cartoon sort of indicates, a nation coming apart. The election results with 4 candidates. You can see why the election ends up the way it does. Because remember, one of your major political parties is split. Lincoln gets only 40% of the popular vote, but got 180 electoral votes. And notice what he does. He carries all of New England, New York, Pennsylvania, okay, and all of what is essentially the old Northwest, plus California and the Oregon Territory, or Oregon by then, okay? The southern wing carries virtually every southern state. Okay, so Breckinridge wins all of the Deep South, gets 72 electoral votes, but by carrying all of that, okay, what you see up there, you guys can see he only got 18% of the popular vote because the South is so rural, so agricultural. So these areas that he can't really he carries, okay, are not big electoral states, and so he only gets 850,000 popular votes. Stephen A. Douglas, and you guys can see, really only carried a couple of states. Okay, he carries Missouri and part of New Jersey, and got 12 electoral votes, but won 1.5 million, well, not quite, but 1,400,000 popular votes. He got 30% of the popular vote, but only carried and only won about 1.5 states. The Constitutional Union Party under John Bell got more electoral votes with less popular vote than Stephen A. Douglas did. Okay. And John Bell was only able to carry Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia. Lincoln was able to win, though, barely, squeak out enough electoral votes to win the election. And so in 1860, Abraham Lincoln will be declared the winner. And it becomes pretty clear that the South is moving towards leaving the Union. There were many who were alarmed about this, even in the South. Okay. For example, Kentucky Senator John J. Crittenden proposes a national amendment that is going to be known as the Crittenden Amendment or the Crittenden Compromise. And basically, what he proposes to keep the South in the Union was to write into the Constitution the idea of popular sovereignty. okay, to allow slavery to expand, but only through popular sovereignty. And he hoped that if they could get this amendment process going, that would keep the South in the Union. And it fails. Okay. With Lincoln now declared president, secession begins. And I want you guys to understand, a lot of people think that secession begins only after Lincoln becomes president, and that is not true. The election is held in November, okay? And by December and January, all right, several states have already left the Union, okay? Before Lincoln ever takes office, okay, before Lincoln ever becomes president, okay, remember we elect in November, you don't become president really until March, okay? So when you look at that, look at the states and look at these dates, okay? South Carolina secedes in December of 1860. Mississippi in January of 1861. Alabama in January of 1861, Florida in January of 1861, Georgia in January of 1861. So within about a month, okay, as you flip the year between 1860 and 1861, okay, within a little over a month, all 7 of these blue states have left the Union before Lincoln ever takes office. So you can't say that Lincoln watched as these states left the Union. He did not. He wasn't even president. Buchanan did. And this is one of the things that many of us look back on Buchanan's presidency and wonder why he did not take more action than what he did. But under his watch, essentially, 7 states leave the Union, believing that the election of Lincoln is so bad that they can't go on. And so South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and then Texas all leave the Union before Lincoln becomes president. Now, the next key thing happens really after Lincoln becomes president, and that is the firing on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. As these states left the Union, Lincoln has to decide about and how to proceed. And Lincoln has to deal with for example, South Carolina leaves the Union, but there's still coastal forts out here that belong technically to the national government. And so Lincoln needs those either to be supported, supplied even, okay? But South Carolina, of course, wants them taken away from the federal government. And so what it leads to in April of 1861, shortly after Lincoln became president, was a small battle over Fort Sumter here, okay? That didn't really result in any casualties, but technically it's viewed as the first shots of the Civil War. So when Sumter happens, okay, and Lincoln makes it pretty clear that he is going to try to keep these forts, he is going to take action, that when you go back here at the map, these other states leave the Union. Okay, so Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and then Tennessee all leave the Union after Fort Sumter. Okay, so down here you can see where they seceded after Fort Sumter. So Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee come out right after, within a few months after Fort Sumter. There are some slave states, though, that do not leave the Union. Even though they were slave-holding states, they did not leave the Union. Missouri and Kentucky are good examples. Maryland and Delaware, too. Okay, so these become what are known as the border states. Okay, they technically permitted slavery or allowed slavery, but did not leave the Union as a result of Fort Sumter. All right, we have the opening shots of the Civil War. Our next lecture is going to be about the early stages of the Civil War and some of the early battles and some of the early problems with fighting this Civil War. So we'll talk about that next time.